Under the fifth unit of financial services, which deals with the other financial services, we had discussed about mergers and acquisitions, about venture capital, and recently we had just finished discussing also about factoring. So today we're going to move on to a new topic under this. We're moving on to the next, which is lease financing and hire purchase. So the main objective of any business, of course, we already know is to maximize the profits or the returns to the owners, the economic welfare of the owner. And the firm is going to make various kinds of investments in order to improve, in order to increase the wealth of the shareholders and the stockholders. So after identifying attractive projects that they want to invest in, the firm will consider various methods in order to finance them. So in addition to debt and equity financing, we have two other methods of financing of the projects, which is leasing as well as hire purchase. So leasing and hire purchase, they have emerged as very important sources of intermediate as well as long-term financing of corporate enterprises, especially during these last few decades. So firstly, let's talk about leasing. What is leasing and how exactly does the function of leasing or does the leasing work? So we have already introduced the concept of leasing in the initial situation in the first under the first unit. We just briefly introduced the concept of leasing. So for this part of the lesson, we're going to deal in detail with the concept of leasing. Now, leasing is a very simple but unique innovative source of providing medium-term as well as long-term finance to a business. So it is a method of acquiring the use of an asset without actually buying the asset. Okay, wherein the person or the business can use the asset without actually investing or without actually buying the asset. So this means that if they're not buying the asset, they are not the owners of the asset. So basically it refers to renting of the asset. Now leasing, it provides 10% finance to a business which requires new plant and machinery, and then office equipment also it allows for leasing, and then any other kinds of equipments like industrial equipments and for construction as well as commercial equipments. Therefore, we can say that leasing is an alternative to borrowing of funds for the actual purchase of fixed assets. Now, leasing, it refers to a contract between two parties, a lessor and a lessee. So the lessor is the party who owns the equipment, and the lessee is the person who is using the equipment for the lease of specifically approved items of equipment on payment of a periodical amount, which is known as a lease rental, for a definite period of lease. Now, the lease rental will be paid by the lessee to the lessor, and it incorporates or includes the components of interest charges as well as the actual cost of the asset. Okay, so it include the cost for using of the asset and any other interest charges with relation to using of the asset. And the rentals, they may be payable either at the beginning of the month, at the end of the month, or at beginning of a quarter, end of a quarter, half yearly, or even throughout the entire year. And the lease rentals can also be agreed both in terms of amount and timing as per the profits and cash flow position of your lessee. Now, at the expiry of the lease period, the asset will revert to the lessor, that is, it will go back to the lessor, who is the real or the legal owner of the asset. Remember, the person who's using the asset is not the owner of the asset. He's just a user. Let's just say he's renting the asset, but the asset actually belongs to the lessor, somebody else. Okay. However, in case of long-term lease contracts, the lessee is generally given an option to buy or even to renew the lease. Now, in the words of M.H. Miller and C.W. Upton, leasing separates ownership and use as two economic activities, and it facilitates asset use without actual ownership. Therefore, based upon this definition, we can say that lease financing is a device or it is an instrument of financing or even money lending, and it is a tool of financing the actual cost from the asset. In fact, it is an agreement in which a particular equipment that is needed by the lessee will be purchased by the lessor or the financier from a manufacturer that have been selected by the lessee, and then the lessee can make use of the asset on payment of fixed rentals over a period of time determined already in advance. And additionally, leasing is also said to be a process by which a firm can obtain the use of certain fixed assets for which it must make a number of contractual, periodic, tax-deductible payments. And then leasing is also said to be an alternative to purchase of an asset in order to acquire the services of that asset. And by leasing an asset, the lessee will essentially acquire its used value from the lessor who actually purchases and owns the asset. Okay, so now the concept of leasing, lease financing, is based upon an observation that has been made by Donald B. Grunt. According to him, why own a cow when the milk is so cheap? All you really need is the milk and not the cow. Okay, so lease financing is based upon this observation. So basically what it means is that why should I purchase an asset? Why should I purchase the machine when I only need the equipment that is going to be produced by the machine? Okay, so why should I purchase the machine when I only need the equipment to be used by that machine? Therefore, I can just get the machine from somebody else, produce it, and then when it's time to return it, when I have what I need, I can return the machine. Okay, so it's based upon this. So let us just go through a little bit of the history of leasing, how it came about in India. Now, leasing activity was initiated in India in the year 1973, and the first leasing company of India was called First Leasing Company of India Limited. Okay, a very literal name. The first leasing company of India was called First Leasing Company of India Limited, and it was set up in the year 1973 by Farooq Irani along with industrialist A.C. Muthia. And for several years, this company, First Leasing Company of India Limited, this company, it remained the only company in the country which was providing leasing, okay, until the 20th century when Finance Corporation was set up around 1980. And by the year 1981, then more and more companies, more and more industrialists started to opt for this lease financing. So the trickle started, and then you have Shetty Investment and Finance, Jai Bharat Credit and Investment, Motor and General Finance, as well as Sundaram Finance. All these companies started to join the leasing game. And when it comes to companies like Sundaram Finance, Motor and General Finance, and Jai Bharat Credit and Investment, these companies were already involved in hire purchase of commercial vehicles, but they were looking for a tax break, a way to reduce their taxes. So because of that, they decided to invest in leasing. They felt that leasing was a good and ideal choice for them to reduce the payment of their taxes. Now, the industry entered the third stage in the growth phase in the late 1982, when numerous financial institutions as well as commercial banks either started leasing or announced plans to enter into the leasing finance. Now, ICICI, Industrial Credit and Investment Corporation of India, it is very prominent among the various financial institutions already, right? We already know that ICICI has definitely provided a lot of financial services in the country. So it is a prominent financial institution already, and it entered the lease financing industry in the year 1983, giving a huge boost to the concept of leasing. And thereafter, more and more people started to invest in the lease financing industry, and leasing eventually became the new gold mine. Okay, this was also the time when the profit performance of the 24 companies, which included First Leasing Company and 20th Century, had already been made. So it felt like more and more companies felt like it was a good option to go and invest in lease financing. And in the meantime, International Finance Corporation also announced its decision to open 4 leasing joint ventures in India. And to add to the leasing boom, even the Finance Ministry, they announced strict measures for enlistment of investment companies on stock exchanges, which made many investment companies turn into leasing companies overnight. Okay. Additionally, when the Finance Ministry announced various measures, okay, with regards to enlistment of investment companies, most of these investment companies, they existed as investment companies and they were working as investment companies. But because of these strict measures, they decided to convert into leasing companies overnight. And this increased the number of lease financing companies in India. And another significant phase in the development of Indian leasing was the Dhotra Committee's recommendation, which is based the recommendations of this committee provided the guidelines for RBI on commercial bank funding to leasing companies. And the growth of leasing in India has distinctively been assisted by funding from various banks and financial institutions. It was based upon the recommendations of this committee that the various banks and financial institutions have started to assist the leasing companies in India, and banks themselves were allowed to offer leasing facilities much later, somewhere in the year 1994. However, even up to date, commercial banking machinery has not been able to make a lot of difference in the leasing scenarios. Always these smaller institutional investments, or the financial institutions, the individual institutions, not necessarily banks, who have been more invested in the lease financing scenario. And the post-liberalization era has also been witnessing slow but sure increase in foreign investment into Indian leasing company industry. Okay, so starting with the entry of various companies, an increasing number of foreign-owned financial firms also have started, and banks also have started engaging, or have started getting interested in the leasing scenario in India as well. Now, what are the essential elements that we see with regards to leasing? So the first essential element is the number of parties to the contract. Now, when we introduced the concept of leasing, we said how one party who owns the asset will give the asset to another party who is in need of the asset. Okay, so basically we can see that it requires at least two members. So there will always be two parties to a contract of lease financing. One party is the owner, who's also called as the lessor, and the second party is your user, who's also known as your lessee. And the second essential element is the asset. Now, the subject matter of a lease financing contract may be an asset, it may be property or equipment. Basically, it can be plant, machinery, land and building. All of these different assets are termed to be the subject matter in case of entering of a leasing contract. And then consideration. So consideration, you already know, is the price that is to be paid for the services that have been rendered. Okay, so here the service is providing the machine to the lessee. So what should the lessee pay for that particular service of the lessor? So the right to use an asset is given to lessee for a consideration that is called as the lease rental, and the lease rental will be determined generally by the lessor. Of course, he will also take into consideration the lessee's situation also, but mostly it will only be the lessor who will take into consideration the capital that has been invested in the asset, the depreciation on the asset, interest that he should be receiving on the capital, repairs costs, maintenance costs. Okay, all of these costs will be included in the cost of the lease rental, or the consideration for the lease agreement. And the next essential element is lease period. Now, a contract of leasing is usually undertaken for a fixed period, and it could be for a long term, medium term, or even short term. And it may sometimes even spread over the entire economic or entire useful life of the asset. So, for example, if the asset has a life of 10 years, you can even lease the asset for the entire period of 10 years. And generally, at the expiry of the lease period, at the end of the lease period, the asset will always revert back to the lessor, who is the real owner of the asset, or there is a chance that the lessor may offer the asset for sale to the lessee also. So there are two ways in which the asset is treated after the end of the lease period. Either it will revert to the lessor, the owner, or it can be sold by the lessor to the lessee. Now, the next element, use versus ownership. Now, during the term of lease, ownership of the asset remains with the lessor, whereas the possession of the asset is with the lessee. The main real owner is always going to be the lessor, but the person who is using it, the one who has the asset, is the lessee. So the lessee will be allowed to use the asset during the entire tenure of your lease agreement. Okay, he is allowed to use it, but he is not owning the asset. And then finally, the last essential element is the termination of the contract. Now, in general, any contract comes to the end at the expiry of a period. Okay, so the lease contract will come to an end at the expiry of the period, and after the termination, the contract may be renewed for another period of time. Then the lessee, who is a user of the asset, may offer to buy the asset, or the third situation is the asset will go back to the lessor and the owner of the asset, and he can lease it to another third party. Okay, so now let's talk about a lease agreement. Okay, so the contract or the agreement that is entered into between the lessor and the lessee is termed as a lease agreement. And With regards to lease agreement, it has a few features. Let's go through them. Firstly, the lessor will agree to purchase an asset for leasing to the lessee, and then the lessee will agree to take on the asset on lease. Okay, so basically it happens like this. The lessee, the user of the asset, needs a machine, but he doesn't have money. So he goes to the lessor who has the money. He will buy the asset on behalf of the lessee, and then he'll offer the asset on lease rentals to the lessee, and the lessee can use the asset and pay the rentals on that. Okay, so the second feature is the lessee is going to be given possession of the leased asset. This will be subject to the condition of the payment of lease rental, as well as compliance with any other terms and conditions. And the third point, the lessee will agree to insure as well as maintain the asset during the tenure of the lease. So the lessee, the one who's using the asset, will have to take care of the asset during the entire period of lease. Okay, he'll have to take care of the insurance, and then any maintenance, all that also will be taken care of by the lessee. And then the fourth point, the title of the asset remains with the lessee. The owner will forever be the lessor until and unless he decides to sell off the asset to another party, or if he sells off the asset to the lessee himself. Then the next point, the lessee agrees as not to make any changes or effect improvement or dispose equipment or do anything which may jeopardize the lessor's interest in the equipment. So when it comes to the asset, the lessee must not change in any way the actual figure of the asset. Okay, if the asset that has been given, let's say they've given a car on lease. Now the car was originally white in color, and the lessor has given the lessee a white car. However, the lessee changed the color of the car. They have changed it into a red color car. Now there has been a change, and because of that, the interest of the lessor has decreased. So what is given in the lease contract is that there must not be any kinds of changes which would affect the interest of the lessor in his own asset. And then, as user of the equipment, the lessee should indemnify the lessor against any claims made by third parties arising out of the lessor's ownership of the asset. Now, in case there are any claims which have been made by third parties arising due to the ownership of the asset, then under that situation, the user of the asset, who is your lessee, you will have to indemnify or make good the losses of these third parties. And the lease contract provides for the lessor's rights of action in the event of a default by the lessee during the lease period. So if there's anything that has been done by the lessor, if something has been done by the lessee, let's say he has defaulted the payment during the period of lease, then the lease contract provides that the lessor can take action under these situations. Okay, if he hasn't paid the lease rental, then the lessor can either claim back the asset or he can take any other action which he deems fit. And at the end of the lease period, the agreement provides either for the renewal of the contract, return of the asset to the lessor, or for the sale of the asset to the lessee by the lessor. Okay, and then contents of a lease agreement. So what should be included in a lease agreement? Now the lease agreement, it specifies the legal rights and obligations of the lessor as well as the lessee. So it typically contains terms relating to the description of the lessor, the description of the lessee, as well as the equipment. And description by description of lessor and lessee, we don't mean their facial features and all that. We refer to their names, their contact, their addresses, and so on and so forth. Okay, and it also should include the amount, time, and the place for the lease rental payments, and the time and place for the delivery of the asset or delivery of the equipment, and the responsibility of the lessee for taking delivery as well as possession of the leased equipment, and then lessee's responsibility for maintenance, repairs, registration, etc., as well as the lessor's right in case of default by the lessee. And it also includes lessee's right to enjoy the benefits of the warranties provided by the equipment manufacturer or supplier. Now, remember, even though the product has been sold to the lessor and the lessee is the real owner of the asset, yet the lessee is the user of the asset is the one who's enjoying the warranties provided by the manufacturer. Okay, and additionally, insurance to be taken by the lessee on behalf of the lessor, because he's the one using it. So he's the one who has to take insurance, because if anything happens, he's the one the lessee or the user is the one who will face losses. And additionally, variation in lease rentals if there is a change in certain external factors like bank interest, depreciation rates, fiscal incentives, and so on. And also, it should include options of lease renewal for the lessee, and then return of equipment on the expiry of the lease period, and arbitration procedure in the event of a dispute. Okay, so these are what should be included in a lease agreement contract. Now, let us talk about the different types of leasing. When it comes to types of leasing, depending upon the transfer of risk, depending upon the transfer of rewards to the lessee also, the period of lease, the duration of a lease, as well as the number of parties that are going to be involved in a lease transaction can be based upon these conditions. We can classify lease financing into two main categories. So the first category is your financial lease, and the second category is your operating lease. So firstly, let's talk about finance lease. Now, finance lease is generally longer in duration as opposed to operating lease. So the long-term, non-cancelable lease contracts are known as financial leases. And the essential point or the main idea of a financial lease agreement is that it contains a condition whereby the lessor will agree to transfer the title for the asset at the end of the lease period at a nominal cost. Now, the main key point when it comes to a financial lease is that there is a condition. It may or may not exist depending upon the two parties. Okay, so generally, it will contain a condition or a clause wherein the lessor, the actual owner of the asset, will transfer the title of the asset or transfer the possession of the asset to the lessee who is using the asset at a nominal cost. In case of lease, it must give an option to the lessee to purchase the asset he has used at the expiry of the lease. And under this lease, basically the lessor, who is the owner, will recover up to 90% of the fair value of the asset as lease rentals, and the lease period is generally 75% of the economic life of the asset. Okay, so based on that, if the asset is has a life value of 10 years, then they can lease it for up to 7.5 years. Okay, now the lease agreement is irrevocable in nature, which means it cannot be cancelled, it cannot be transferred back to the owner of the asset, and practically all the risk incidental to the asset ownership and all of the benefits which are arising from the transfer of the assets are going to be given to the lessee himself, and additionally he will also bear the cost of maintenance, insurance, repairs also. All of these will be paid for by the lessee or the owner of the asset. So basically what this means is that the owner of the asset, who is the lessor, he'll only have the title deeds with him. That is, he'll only be the owner. He'll not be able to reap any benefits out of the utilization of the asset. And the financial lease is also known as capital lease because it's generally used for these really heavy or capital equipments like plant, machinery, land, building, and so on and so forth. Okay, generally for really heavy machinery. So in India, financial leases are very popular, especially with high cost and high technology equipment. Now, basically, in simplest words, a financial lease is a lease in which the lessor will transfer all the risk and rewards of ownership of asset to the lessee for lease rentals. Okay, so basically the lessee in the same condition as it would have been if they had purchased the asset. Okay, basically the lessee almost becomes the owner of the asset, just only problem is that he does not have the title deed. So finance lease basically have two phases. The first phase is the primary phase, a primary period, and the second phase is your secondary period. Now, in case of primary period, this is a non-cancelable period, and in this part of the phase, the lessor will recover his total investment through the lease rental, and the primary period may last for an indefinite period of time. And the lease rental, when it comes to the secondary period, is much smaller than that of your primary period. So let's look a little into the features of your financial lease. So based upon what we have already discussed, we can see the features of financial lease. So first feature is that a financial lease is a device that gives the lessee a right to use an asset. Okay, so this feature is the same even in case of the other lease that we're going to talk about, the operating lease. And the next point, the lease rental charged by the lessor during the primary period of lease is sufficient to recover his or her investment. So during the primary period of time, whatever amount has been charged by the lessor in terms of rental, lease rental will be quite enough to cover for the entire cost of the asset that is being leased. And the lease rental, as we've already said, is for the secondary period is much smaller and is often known as just peppercorn rental. Additionally, lessee is responsible for maintenance of asset under financial lease. Okay, he's not just using the asset, he also has to take care of the asset. And no asset-based risk and rewards is taken by the lessor. Anything that is earned by the asset, use of the asset, or any problems incurred due to the use of the asset will not be taken by the lessor. And these kinds of leases are generally non-cancelable. Therefore, the lessor's investment is assured. No matter what, he is going to get money because you cannot cancel the financial lease. And then you have operating lease. Now, any lease other than a finance lease is called as an operating lease. So you have finance lease and operating lease. Anything that's not finance is operating. Anything that's not operating is a finance lease. So under operating lease, the risk and rewards incidental to the ownership of the asset are not transferred by the lessor to the lessee. If there are anything that they're going to earn with regards when they are using the asset, then that earnings or the problems that are going to be received on the ownership of the asset will be enjoyed by the lessor, the owner of the asset, and not by the lessee, who is a user of the asset. So the term of such lease is generally much less than economic life of the asset, and in that way, the total investment of the lessor will not be recovered through the lease rentals, especially during the primary period of the. Now, in case of operating lease, the lessor will usually provide advice to the lessee with regards to maintenance, repairs, and technical know-how of the leased asset. And that is why in case of operating lease, it is sometimes also known as service lease. Okay, remember the lessor, the owner of the asset, will provide advice to the lessee, the user of the asset, with regards to repairs, maintenance, and technical know-how. So they're providing additional services. So they're also called as a service lease. Now, an operating lease stands in contrast to the financial lease in almost all aspects. It's quite a lot of difference from the operating lease and the financial lease. And this lease agreement, your operating lease agreement, it gives to the lessee only a limited right to use the asset, and the lessor is going to be responsible for the upkeep as well as maintenance of the asset. In case of your finance lease, the lessee or the user is the one who is responsible for maintenance, upkeep, repairs of the asset. However, in case of operating lease, because it's only for a short period of time, so the lessor or the owner is going to be responsible for upkeep and maintenance. Okay. And additionally, the lessee will not be given any uplift to purchase the asset at the end of the lease period. Okay, you will receive a contract of our operating lease in which at the end of the lease period, the lessee will be given a choice to buy the asset. Okay, it's quite different from financial lease under these situations. In case of finance lease, after the termination or after the end of the lease agreement, the lessor will often offer the asset to the lessee to purchase at normal cost. Okay, however, under this situation, in case of operating lease, no matter what, the lessee will not be given a chance to purchase the asset at the end of the lease period. And normally, the lease is for a short period of time, and even otherwise, this operating lease can be revocable at a very short notice. So you can have mines, computer hardware, trucks, automobiles, all of these are suitable for operating lease because the rate of obsolescence is very high in these kinds of assets. And now let's look into a few features of operating lease. So operating lease has a few features. Firstly, the leased term is much lower than the economic life of the asset. Okay, so as we've already seen, the duration of the asset, let's say it has a life for 10 years, but operating lease will always be for a number of periods shorter than the entire lifetime of the asset. So let's say it can be for 2 years, 5 years, all right? And then the next feature, the lessee has the right to terminate the lease by giving a short notice, and no penalty is charged for that. In case of financial lease, it is irrevocable, it cannot be cancelled. However, in case of operating lease, the contract can be cancelled, it can be terminated by just giving a notice or a short notice. And even if they are terminating the contract, penalty will not be charged for early termination. And the next feature is that the lessor, he provides the technical know-how of the leased asset to the lessee. Okay, they're providing additional services by providing knowledge with regards to how to use the asset to the lessee. And then the risk and rewards incidental to the ownership of the asset are going to be borne by the lessor. In case of operating lease, the lessor himself or the owner of the asset himself will take care of all of the assets, risks and rewards in relation to ownership of the asset. And finally, the lessor has to depend on leasing of an asset to different lessee for recovery of his or her amount. The lessor will not have only one client. He can have a lot of other parties who are going to enter into a contract with him so that the lessor can recover the amounts with regards to how much he's invested in the particular asset. Okay, so these are the different features with regards to our two kinds of leases, your financial lease and the operating lease.